Welcome to the Stop Suffering in Silence podcast with your host, Denise Walsh and Rachel Timothy.
Hey, you guys. Welcome back to Stop SIS, Stop Suffering in Silence. My name is Denise Walsh, and I'm here with co-host Rachel Timothy. And today we have a super special guest. In fact, our guest is somehow related to Rachel. So I will let her introduce him.
Yes, we are totally related. He's my second cousin's husband. Yeah, super tight. And I met him, a couple years ago?
Yes.
For the first time. But he is a fantastic guy. This is Neil Schori, and he's a pastor up in Chicago. And a super unique situation just kind of fell in his lap in a sense. And he was put in a situation where God used him in incredible ways in a nationally known crime case that I don't think, when he signed up to be a pastor, he ever thought that he would be interviewed on CNN for, a crime case. But you never know where God's going to lead you and what God will place in your lap. And he handled it, in my opinion, extremely well. But there's also a lot that I feel like he gleaned from that situation that now impacts him as a pastor and as a dad to 3 girls. And, his wife is involved in trafficking aftercare programs. And so they got a unique perspective on all the things that we talk about. So I just think this is going to be a fantastic conversation. Neil, thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the gracious introduction. So good to be with you both.
Cool.
So I'm excited for this conversation because I don't know a ton. So I'm really curious as to how all of this started. And so I guess let's first start with, how long have you been a pastor? When did this situation happen? And maybe start there.
Yeah, I was ordained a very long time ago in 2002, which is insane to me when I think about that. I'm like, ooh, how did that happen? So I was ordained in 2002.
It doesn't sound that far away, but it actually was.
Yeah, I've seen the jokes online, when you think about 20 years ago, you're thinking about the 70s and it's like, that, not anymore. No, it's crazy. It's like, time goes so quickly. It's so true. So yes, I've been a pastor officially since 2002. I worked in hospice. I've been a volunteer police chaplain and as a pastor in multiple churches in the Chicagoland area. So yeah, done it for quite a while now.
And when did the situation that we're going to talk about take place?
It was relatively early on in my ministry, and I worked for a church in the suburbs, a couple suburbs away in Bolingbrook, and I served as the counseling pastor at this church. So it was a large enough church that they kind of had to have somebody to sit with people all day long, which was awesome. But I sort of got to that place where you do. I think a lot of times in your work, you sort of feel like, I think I've kind of seen everything. Now, I knew not to say that, but I sort of felt it almost like, yeah, I kind of know what I'm facing today. And I learned really, really quickly, when you think that, set that aside because it's just not the truth. And I realized really quickly that I was really out of my element and out of my depth. And it was really important for me to learn that. So would you like me to just sort of jump into the story?
Yeah. So were you in this role as a counseling pastor when it happened?
Yes, I was. So at this whole story started at the end of 2005, early 2006, and went all the way to mid to late 2007.
Okay. So yeah, you were, I know as a clinical psychologist, it took me 2 years to kind of feel like, all right, I know what I'm doing.
Right.
And I had a ton of paperwork with Medicaid and all the things that you have to learn. I don't know if you had all of that kind of stuff, but it can take a while to feel comfortable in a coaching or counseling kind of position, feeling like what you're doing is helpful and you're giving good feedback and that kind of thing. So to have an experience like this in your first few years, I'm guessing was jarring.
It was extremely jarring. And so I sat with people around a variety of issues. So pre-marriage, marriage issues, gender identity issues, self-harm. I sort of had a lot of things. A lot of it centered around relationships. And probably at the end of 2005, early 2006, there was a woman in my church named Stacy, and she came to me after a service, and she said, "Hey, you're Neil, right?" I said, "Yeah." She actually knew my wife. She didn't really know me. She knew of me because we had kids the same age, and they were in the nursery at the same time. And she said, "I'd love to sit down with you soon and talk about what she characterized as regular marriage issues," as if there really are regular marriage issues. You know, everybody's situation's unique. So that's what she said. I said, "Hey, reach out to me early next week. We'll get something on the calendar." So she did. And we ended up meeting at a coffee shop just down the street from the church. And, for about 45 minutes to an hour, she kind of just told me things about her life and, said she hadn't been married that long. And she just sort of wanted to run some stuff past me. And she shared stuff that definitely there was a lot of jealousy in the relationship. She didn't seem overly concerned about it. Each time she would talk about how he was jealous, she said a lot of times it's centered around her going to a store, like even just a grocery store. Like she went to Meijer for a couple of hours or an hour and a half, and he kind of blew up her phone. And she said, I wish he wouldn't call so much. But then she'd really quickly turn it and she'd say, but it really is just because he loves me so much. And I remember hearing that and sort of watching this dance that she did as she described it. And I thought, ooh, this makes me uncomfortable. Yet she seems nervous about it and then really quickly pivots. So I can't really land any place. And she really described a lot of things like that. And at the end of the session, she said, well, this was really helpful just to talk about it. And she said, maybe we could meet again. I said, certainly. The next day, I got a message from her and she said, well, now that I've met with you, my husband wants to meet with you also with me. And I'm like, oh, okay, let's do that. So the next week we met, and immediately we sat in that same coffee shop. They sat on the same side of the table. The first thing that I noticed, which was really surprising, but when you're sitting with people, you don't want to act surprised because that's the quickest way for people to not want to talk to you anymore about like real things. I noticed a really big age difference. So I asked, I'm like, yeah, so, you guys have been married a short time. And he jumped in. He goes, yeah. He said, she's not with me for my looks. And it looked like more like a father and daughter than a husband and wife. They got together when she was 17 and he was 47. And that is legal in Illinois, unfortunately, but it is. And I think he knew that. I look back at it now and I think, wow, he really knew exactly what he was doing. He also stopped to see her regularly at the hotel. She worked at a front desk overnights at a hotel in the area, and he would stop there and see her. So I look back now and I see this really long pattern of grooming. And she felt really pursued. She felt really loved. She came from a troubled family. Her mom was actually a missing person. She went missing in the city of Chicago, maybe 10 years earlier. And just lots of tragedy in her family, lots of run-ins with the law, just a whole lot of issues, lots of health issues that certainly couldn't be controlled. It just felt like there was a whole lot going on with this family. It sort of felt like a hurricane of emotions and health issues and everything. So as I was sitting with them, one of the first things that Drew said, her husband, who was a police officer in Bolingbrook, also, he was a sergeant in the police force. He said, I just want to let you know, I've never abused her. This is the first time I'm meeting this guy, and he says that. And I just thought to myself, I knew better than to say it. I thought, well, that's funny because I didn't ask if you did. I felt like he was sort of telling on himself. And he said, well, as a matter of fact, one time she hit me. And I look over at her, kind of glanced at her, and she looked down and looked ashamed. And I said, I'm interested to hear about that. And she said, well, we had a little family get together and it was around a pool, and she'd like prepared the whole day and cooked and dressed up and just wanted everybody to have a good time. And she said, she stood over by the pool as people were arriving, and Drew ran over in front of the whole family, picked her up and threw her into the pool with all of her clothes on, her makeup done, like everything. And she said, I was so mad that he would do that. And he was laughing, and everybody else sort of looked like, ooh, what's going on here? We don't want to have anything to do with that. And she said she ran inside, and he followed her in and said, oh, what's your problem? It was just a joke. I was just teasing you. What are you so sensitive about? He's really gaslighting her, taking away from her sense of agency and feelings and making her really question her own reality. And he said, then she reached into the freezer and grabbed a frozen steak and hit me on the arm with it. And he said, it really hurt. And I'm just like, oh, I just thought, boy, this is serious crazy making. Like it made me think, wow, there is something going on here. And I'm just wondering if I'll get into this. I ended up meeting with them probably 4 more times over the next 18 months. And it was really just maybe a little bit more of the same thing in each time that I met. I did a ride along one time in Drew's police car with him. And I spent about 3 or 4 hours with him. And it was really interesting to me because there were moments when it was just a really enjoyable time being with him, which made me feel surprised. And then almost as quickly as we would turn a corner, I would get this almost like I don't know how to describe it other than it was physically cold in the car when the environment didn't change. He didn't change the air conditioner. Like it felt icy and cold. And there were times when I'd glance over at him when he was driving and he seemed present and engaged. And there were other times when it felt like, have you ever looked at a snake in the eyes? Have you ever looked at an alligator? They just don't seem to have something. They don't seem to have the full, like, they don't have any emotions. Like sharks don't have emotions. Alligators don't seem to have emotions. Snakes don't. They just seem like dangerous. And I remember thinking to myself as I sat with him, this man seems very dangerous. And it wasn't just a thought that I had. At one point, Drew looked at me and he said, I really appreciate the help that you've given us. He said, I just need to tell you some things. Stacy's really crazy. And I was just like, oh, well, tell me about that. And he said, I couldn't believe he said this, and I feel almost embarrassed even saying it, but I'll share what he said. He said, well, Neil, you know how women are at that time of the month? And even I don't have any reason to be embarrassed that he said that to me, but I just thought, did you really say that? And I looked at him and I said, I'm really uncomfortable with you saying that kind of thing about your wife. And I said, if you want to talk about you, you're free to talk about you to me all you'd like. But I'm not going to go there. And it just immediately, it was like this switch washed over him and he got silent. Yet we didn't stop anywhere. He kept driving. I'm in the car with him. I'm a captive audience. And he hardly said anything. And then he would minutes later sort of change and, it's almost dinner time. Do you want to go through a drive-through? Really? Like, okay. Like I didn't really want to eat, but I said, sure. So we got food and then we went to this forest preserve that was in the middle of nowhere. And I started getting nervous again. And even on that ride along, I texted Brandy, my wife, and I said, hey, I just want to give you a heads up of where I am. I've never done that when I was sitting with someone and spending time with them in counsel. But I had a sense that I just wanted her to know where I was in case something happened. There were no other cars around. It was getting dark and we were in a forest preserve parking lot. And I just thought, yeah, I'm not comfortable with this. I couldn't wait to get out of the car.
I have one quick question.
Please.
So out of the 4 times that you met with them, did she ever meet with you again alone, or was basically he the tag along every single time, which is really telling in itself?
It is. So it was mostly with the 2 of them from that point on. I think I met with her 2 more times total alone. And the last time that I met with her was alone. So, but yes, I agree with you 100% that he always wanted to be present. He always wanted to really control the narrative.
Yeah. Okay.
I'll fast forward, if that's okay, to the last meeting that I had with Stacy. It was on August 30th, 2007. she sent me a message and she said, "Hey, Neil, I really need to talk to you. Is there any way that you could meet tomorrow?" And that was kind of out of the ordinary. She never asked for a meeting that quickly. And I just had this weird sense, and I've never had it before. I've never had it again before a counseling session. I just had this weird sense that there was something serious going on, and I really needed to be like awake to it. So so I said yes to her, and I reached out to a good friend of mine in the congregation. Okay, he might have met her before, but he didn't know who she was. And I reached out to my friend Marco. I'm like, "Hey, Marco, this might sound really weird, but I'm meeting someone in the church tomorrow, one-on-one. I just feel the need that I need to have someone who witnesses that my meeting with her happened." And he just goes, "Okay." And I said, I'm not going to tell you anything about her or what's going on, but I just feel like I need a witness. I don't want you to sit really close, but just sit a few tables away so that you can just say, "Yes, Neil met Stacy this day around this time." And he goes, "Done." So I'm like, okay. So the next day I got to the Starbucks. It was a different coffee shop. She was already sitting outside in the cafe area. So I went inside, grabbed a drink, came out. And for probably the first 30 minutes, maybe 40, she kind of told me the same kinds of story. And I just thought, I just feel like there's more. I feel like there's more. And at one point she stopped and she looked at me, got serious, and she said, "Neil, I think I want to tell you something else." And I said, "Okay." I said, "Well, Stacy, this is your story. So whatever you want to share. And if you change your mind, you don't have to share it. You could share it with me another time." She goes, "Okay." Talked for a few more minutes. Didn't seem like it was going anywhere. And then out of the blue, she just blurted out, "He did it." And I'm like, "I'm sorry, he did what?" And she said, "Drew killed Kathleen and made it look like an accident." And she said, "Kathleen was Drew's third wife. I'm his fourth." And I just felt like the air go out of my lungs. And I just stared at her, and she was really quiet and tears were streaming down her face. And I just looked at her and I said, "How do you know that?" And she gave me tons of details. She said, back in 2004, I think it was April 2004, she said, Drew and I went to sleep together one night, and she said, "It's kind of our habit to go to bed together every night. Well, like that's just sort of what we've always done." And she said, "We went to bed and I woke up in the middle of the night and he wasn't there." And she says, "That was weird." She said, "I felt like I needed to look around the house. He wasn't there." So I called him and he didn't answer, and I texted him and he didn't answer. And she's like, "This is so strange." And she said, hours later, he came back. She said, "I heard someone come into the laundry room." And she said, I quickly went in, and she said he was there standing and he was wearing all black, head to toe. And she said, like, black hat, black shirt, black jacket, black pants, black socks, black shoes, like all black. And he was carrying a duffel bag. And she said, "Drew, where were you?" And he looked at her with this kind of smirk on his face, and he goes, "You know where I was." She's like, "No." She said, "They did that 3 times. And each time he goes, 'You know where I was.'" Then he starts taking his clothes off and putting them in the washer. And then he opened the duffel bag and dumped the contents into the washing machine. And he walked out of the room. And she said she just peeked into the washing machine, and they were his black clothes, and there were women's clothes that weren't hers. And she said all of a sudden she was like, "Oh my gosh, I think I do know what he did," because Drew and Kathleen were still in the middle of this really contentious divorce. And a little bit later, he came to her in the house and he said, "Hey, we need to sit down and talk for a minute." And she said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "In a few hours, the police are going to be here." Now, remember, he was the police, but he said, "The police will be here. And if you tell them what I tell you to say, this will be the perfect crime." And she said, he sat her down and he coached her for hours on what to say. He told her exactly what to say about where he was. So he gave her this alibi. She gave that same alibi to the police, who, by the way, allowed Drew to sit with her while she was interviewed by them. they wouldn't do that for anybody else, right? So it's this this corruption that exists, and I've seen this many times since then among the police. Like so many times we grow up and we're taught like, oh, you trust people in authority, you trust the police, you trust firefighters, you trust people who make decisions, and it's like, but do you? Is that really wise? So she told me all this, and I said, Stacy, what do you want me to do with this information? And I said that for two reasons. One, because I really didn't know what to do. I wasn't trained in domestic violence, which is really a shame. Went to seminary, have a master's degree in counseling, wasn't trained in this area at all. So I felt really awful about that in that moment. I just thought, I have no idea what to do. The second reason is she still lived with him, and I knew enough to know that it's not for me to tell her how to handle a situation that she has to deal with and I don't. So I wanted her to know that she had agency. And really quickly, she just looked back at me and she said, I don't want you to do anything. And then she stared at me, and I'll never forget how she looked at me. She said, I just want you to know. That's all she said. And it just stuck. It just stuck. I went back to my office after saying goodbye, and the voicemail voicemail light on my phone was flashing. I had a weird feeling, so I checked it real quick. It was Drew, her husband. I listened to the voicemail. It said, "Hey Neil, it's Drew Peterson. I haven't seen you in a while, but I know you're meeting with Stacy today." And I just all the alarms are going off inside me. And he said, "It's a really beautiful day. Why don't we meet over at Clow Airport in Bolingbrook and go for a ride in my ultralight?" And I'm just like trying to get my bearing about me. And I knew what I had to do. I knew I had to call him back right away and try to throw him off. So I took a deep breath, kind of asked God to calm me, picked up the phone. He answered right away, asked me to meet him over at the airport for a ride in his aircraft. And I said, "Oh, hey, Drew, thanks so much for the offer. But my wife is on bed rest we're having twins." And he did know that, and it was true. And I said, "So I pretty much go to work and then I come home and I take care of her and our 3-year-old. So how about a rain check?" And he just goes, "Yep, absolutely. Yep, that sounds great." And I hung up, and then I just started wrestling with this. Am I handling this right? Is it right for me not to tell anyone? What do I do? I had no idea what to do. So I went home and I did tell Brandy. As soon as I got home, I just knew I can't hold all this. It was just too much. It was just eating me alive. And she said, "I think you have to do what she asked you to do." And she said, "He's the police. There's no one's going to believe you over him. This was already classified as an accident. Like, this woman was dead and buried, and this was classified as an accident. A 40-year-old woman died in a dry bathtub, and they classified it as an accident, and she was healthy." Didn't add up to me, but it apparently did to Will County, Illinois. And didn't sit well with me, and I wrestled with it, but I chose to be quiet. 2 months later, almost exactly to the day, I got a call from a former coworker. I changed churches in the meantime, had nothing to do with this, had to do with having new babies and needing more income, to be honest. Not super spiritual, but the right thing for my family. So literally a 10-minute drive, I was at a new church. And right before I left for work that particular morning, I got a call from my coworker, Mary, at that old church. And she said, "Hey, Neil," she said, "did you see the front page of the Chicago Tribune?" And I'm like, "No, what's going on?" And she said, "The front page headline is Stacy Peterson is missing." I don't remember saying goodbye to Mary. I don't remember saying anything else. The next thing I know, I ran up the stairs of our townhouse, and I found my wife, and I just grabbed her and hugged her, and I said, "Stacy's missing, and I'm 100% confident that Drew killed her." And we both just started sobbing because she'd become friends. Brandy and Stacy had become friends. We had kids the same age. And I knew at that point, yes, now obviously I'm going to the police, because the way I read it from her was, don't do anything now. I have to live with him. So I thought, okay, well, now I go to the police. And it didn't look like it was going to be hard because the state police set up a tip line for Stacy Peterson. District 5 headquarters in Illinois set up a tip line. So I immediately called the tip line, and I thought, I'm going to get in and talk to someone. So I left a voicemail. I didn't leave a lot of detail, but I said, hey, I'm a pastor and I have information on Stacy's disappearance. Please give me a call. They didn't call. I waited a day. They didn't call. So I decided to drive there. I thought, okay, so maybe they're just getting a lot of calls. So I drove there. I walked to the front and I said, hey, I have information on Stacy Peterson's disappearance. I left a voicemail for you guys on the tip line, but I haven't heard from anybody, and it's been over a day. And I said, can somebody talk to me now? We'll take your name. We'll take your name. We'll call you if we need to. And I said, you need to. You need to. And they just, yeah. Took my name, sent me away. But I'm pretty persistent about stuff like this because it was just nagging me. And I'll say just happened to be serving as a grand juror for the 3-month period that you do as a grand juror. I'd never served on a jury before, and I never have since, but I was a grand juror for 3 months. And this was around week 10 of a 12-week commitment. So you go for a full day for 12 consecutive weeks. And I'm in week 10 of being a grand juror. So I had to go to Will County anyway. So the next day I go for my grand juror duty, and I'm sitting with this panel of other grand jurors, and we're listening to officers come in and present information on cases, and you have to vote to indict or not. So I'm just completely distracted. I don't really care about the petty crimes that they're talking about as they come in. And then this one guy is just like, it was like a highlighter was all over him. It was just like this, I just knew like something's different. He walks in and he said, ladies and gentlemen of the grand jury, my name is Sergeant Pat Collins from the Illinois State Police. And then he said, he hesitated for a second, and he said, he either said Bolingbrook, Illinois or Will County, Illinois, either way. He said, let's say Will County. Will County, Illinois has a Scott Peterson on its hands. And as soon as he said that, I was like, wait a second, that sounds familiar. Scott Peterson. And I remembered immediately. Scott Peterson was the man who killed his wife and unborn baby in Modesto, California. And it was like in 2006, so a year before this. So this is 2007, and he's referring to Scott Peterson. And as soon as he said that, I thought he's about to say something about Drew and Stacy because Stacy's missing. I raised my hand, which you're not supposed to do. And I said, excuse me. And everybody looks at me like, I don't think you know your role. And I'm like, excuse me, I need to talk to you, Sergeant Collins, right now. You please don't say anything else because I can't hear it. Now that got everybody's attention. So they paused it. The state's attorney looked really irritated with me. The other grand jurors looked irritated with me. And I walked down and I approached Sergeant Collins, and he goes, well, what the blankety blank do you have to say? And I'm like, not right here. How about around the corner where we can be private? He goes, okay, really annoyed. We walk around the corner and he goes, what do you have to say? And I said, Sergeant Collins, I said, I think you were about to say something about Drew Peterson. And he just went sheet white. And I said, I was Stacy Peterson's pastor, and I believe I know what happened to her. I have information that you need. And he said, wait right here. Don't go anywhere. I'm gonna call the state police. So he calls them, comes right back to me, and he goes, okay, go straight there. Don't talk to anyone else. He said it real panicky. And I said, Sergeant Collins, I called the state police. I called you guys, and I went there in person. You don't have to worry about me. And I left, and I went straight there, and they interviewed me for probably 3 hours. And they did a video recording of the interview, and then I had to handwrite a deposition. So I was there probably about 4 hours where I got to tell every single thing that I knew. That's a lot, right? And in the next, so that was 2007. Based on that and the testimony, I believe, of a divorce attorney, they reopened the case of Kathleen Savio, who was the third wife, who, it was deemed an accident in a bathtub. They reopened the case. They actually exhumed her body, and they re-autopsied her. And they reclassified it as a homicide immediately because it was so evident that everything Stacy told me was true on Kathleen's body. So how could she know that unless Drew had told her? So they reopened the case. Drew Peterson ended up being arrested Mother's Day weekend 2009. So like a year and 8 or 10 months later. So it was a long, long time. He was arrested. And then in January 2010, I had to go testify at a preliminary hearing because his defense wanted to keep what I had to say out. They were trying to exclude it all. And they said it was on the basis of hearsay. Like, how do we know this? You know, this is the guy. How do we know any of it's true? And the judge was really wise because he realized that it's likely, he ruled based on a preponderance of evidence that Drew Peterson likely killed Kathleen. The judge said it's likely that Drew killed Stacy, even though Stacy was just missing at this point, so that she couldn't testify against Drew about Kathleen. And he said, because of that, he said, it's based on a common law statute that's 400 years old called forfeiture by wrongdoing. In other words, you forfeit your right to cross-examine a witness if you make another witness disappear. Amazing. So almost everything that I had to say was deemed admissible in court. And they kept trying to push it off and push it off. Ultimately, I testified against Drew Peterson in August of 2012. So it was a long, long journey. He was convicted of murdering Kathleen Savio. He only got 38 years for that, which is ridiculous, right? Like drug sentences can be higher than that, but that's our injustice system. That's, you know, my take on it. And while in prison, he kind of had a hit list, and he decided he was going to try to hire his cellmate to kill the prosecutor. So his cellmate was FBI wiretapped, and he talked obviously about killing Jim Glasgow, the prosecutor. He mentioned me on the tapes, which is quite concerning. So I'm kind of like, I'm going to top 5 for him. And he ended up being convicted of that, got another 61 or 62 years. Okay. So fortunately, Drew, I think, is 69 years old now. So realistically speaking, he'll be in for life. But that was a long journey, and it was a journey where a lot of it I didn't know what to do. But I had to figure it out, right?
Did they ever find Stacy?
They've never found her to this day, but I have assurance from Jim Glasgow, the prosecutor, that they are still going. Ultimately, they will charge him. I believe it.
Wow. What's just ironically, whenever I lived in central Illinois, just for a short time, the person across the street from me worked at the prison where Drew Peterson is. And she said there was a point where they were transferring him or whatever. And I guess I don't know, there's a lot of hoopla going on with some of the other inmates. And somebody made a comment to him about, you know, man, you're really liked. And he goes, well, don't ask my ex-wives. And it's like, holy smokes. Wow. So
there's so many things. Let me tell you just another just piece that I think is, it's just crazy how it just shows that God puts you in situations. He allows you to be there, to be a voice for people. And I think that's always what we're called to be, is to lift people up. But the cellmate that he tried to hire, his cellmate, the one that he tried to hire to kill Jim Glasgow when he got out, was my father-in-law's student in Woodlawn, Illinois.
Wow.
And he was in for attempted murder.
Oh my goodness. Okay, that's interesting.
Isn't that interesting?
Small world.
Like what? Like, I'm in the Chicago area. That's 5 hours. That's 5 hours away. And the guy that he ends up with in a jail cell, he tries to hire, and that was my father-in-law's student in high school? Like, what?
Yeah. And so what lessons did you learn going through? It seems like several things, you know, there's domestic violence, and we can talk a little bit about the relationship side.
Yes.
But then also the legal side of how the legal process works. Yes. It's fascinating that it took years to gather enough evidence to actually convict. So where would you like to start?
Oh gosh. How about immediately after Stacy's disappearance is probably the best time to start, because I often describe it like this. I the question that I kept asking immediately, I just couldn't get it off my heart, was God, why did you allow me to be the person to hear this? So there has to be more. So I was just kind of asking, like, Lord, show me the reason why I was the one to hear this and help me figure out what to do better. Like, how do I learn from this? Because I really was aware of how little I knew. And to me, it's seriously sad to me that I didn't know what I know now, because there could possibly have been a different outcome. I'm not saying that there would have been, but there could possibly have been. So I started praying immediately, and I just said, God, would you send me someone who I can learn from about domestic violence? And I prayed that very consistently over about 2 years. Almost exactly 2 years later, I got a DM on Facebook, and it was a woman named Susan Murphy Milano. She's no longer alive, and I'll share more details, but incredible force of nature. That's the best way to describe her. I think when I met her, she was probably in her late 50s. But she messaged me and she said, you don't know who I am, but I saw your interview on Fox News and I'd really like to sit down and talk with you. And I'm in the Chicago area, so let me know. I'm like, oh, okay, that's random. But I said, yes. So we met at a coffee shop in another suburb, Lisle, Illinois. And she said, well, let me tell you why I wanted to meet with you. She said, let me tell you my story first. And she basically talked about growing up in Chicago. She was a police officer's daughter. He was a well-decorated detective, highly respected in the police force and in the community. But he was just an absolutely narcissistic, sociopathic abuser. And so he always threatened to burn the house down with the whole family inside, and then he'd walk out smiling. And she said, I never once doubted that he would do it. She said, I really believed. She said, he was so physically abusive. He was just unbelievably physically abusive to the family, emotionally abusive in every way. She said, so I got away from him as fast as I could. She moved to New York, and she always hoped that her mom would divorce him, but she needed to be far away. So she worked as a trader in New York City. And one day her mom called her and she said, Susan, I just wanted to let you know I'm officially leaving your dad. And she was so happy. She said, oh my gosh, it's about time. She said, but Mom, are you okay? Are you safe? Do you know what's your plan? And she said, well, your dad wants to meet with me one more time to go over paperwork together. She goes, so I think I'm gonna have him just come over to the house. I feel safe there. She had the sense that she needed to immediately go to see her mom, make sure she was okay. So she flew to Chicago. She got a rental car. She drove up to the little bungalow that she grew up in, and she walked up the stairs to the house, and she said the door was cracked open. So she said, this is weird. So she walked in, and she said immediately she walked into the kitchen and she found her mom dead. And she had a single gunshot wound to the head. And she said she just knew, she felt like someone was in the house. So she walked down the hallway, and each door she would touch would open. And she said the last one was the bathroom on the left. And she reached, and as soon as she turned the handle, there was one more gunshot. And she broke the door open, and it was her dad, and he had killed himself. And she said that day she decided that she couldn't save her mom, but she was going to dedicate the rest of her life to saving as many women as she possibly could. So she moved back home, did a deep dive into domestic violence, and she said, I've done that for a lot of years now, and I've rescued hundreds and hundreds of victims in a variety of ways. And she said, but it took a whole lot of learning, and there were a lot of mistakes that I've made, and a lot of victories that came from battles. And she said, and I just want you to know that I think that you could be a part of helping to change the culture in churches and how churches respond to victims of domestic violence. And I was just like, oh. And she said, I don't know if you know this. She said, but churches are really awful at this. And I said, I didn't know it, but I guess I'm not surprised because I didn't know how to do it. And she said, so many churches give all the wrong advice. Shelters can't stand that churches don't understand this. So she said, but I saw your interview and I just really feel like you could be someone that helps change the culture. She said, so are you interested? And I said, yes. And she said, well, help me understand this, because she really kind of let me have it for about 3 hours, told me all the things I did wrong. She was pretty aggressive, but I didn't mind because I didn't read her as mean. I read her as concerned. And so I listened to everything she said. I said, yes. And she said, well, help me understand this. Why would you want to meet with me again after I've given you such a hard time? And I said, because I prayed for this for 2 years. She just goes, got it. Okay, let's do it. And she said, we're going to have to meet a lot. And I'm just like, yeah, of course. I didn't know what she meant exactly, because we met a lot. Like, it was a lot. The very next week, she calls me. It's like a Thursday. She said, hey, Neil, it's Susan. I'm like, oh, hey, Susan, what's going on? She said, I'm going to be at your church in 30 minutes. And I've got a police officer's wife with me. She's had horrible abuse at his hands for 10 straight years. He's done just unimaginable things to her for 10 straight years. And he actually quoted to her recently. He said, I will do to you. He said, what I do to you will make what Drew did to Stacy look like child's play.
Ah.
And I went, oh, Susan, I've got some other things on my calendar though this afternoon. And she just goes, go ahead and change those, because whatever, she said, no matter what happens in the rest of your day, this is going to be the most important part. See you in 30. So I did. Cleared my day. And it took the rest of the day. We were together till about 6. So she came in and she explained to me, with this police officer's wife, who is shaking and like head on a swivel, just trembling. It was horrific. And also just so sacred to get to sit with someone that was being so vulnerable. Like, it was, I felt like it was a holy moment for me to be able to sit with her and with Susan. It was just an unbelievably touching experience that she would invite us into that pain. And we were there for easily 4 hours, maybe 5. And basically, Susan had created this thing that she hadn't tried yet called the Evidentiary Affidavit of Abuse. You can find it online now at documenttheabuse.com. But basically, it's a document that you walk through with the victim, and they get to detail all the abuse that they've been through. And then you do a video verbatim of them reading the important points of the document. And so we did that. And she said, this is going to empower her and also give her the information that she needs if something happens, and we'll get it to the right authorities so that they get to see her face and hear her words and see her words, and it'll be notarized. And Susan said, I'm pretty sure this is going to hold up in court. Well, I can fast forward and say a lot of states attorneys and judges, federal judges, have even said, yes, this is a good thing, and it's starting to make its way around. So we sat there, did all of this, and when this woman got up to leave, she physically was different than she was when she walked in. She was no longer shaking. Now it wasn't like this, perfect fix, but her countenance was different and her eyes looked different. She looked like she had hope. And I just remember thinking, she was right. Susan was right. This was the most amazing thing that I possibly could have been a part of today. And this woman left. Ultimately, I ended up testifying against her husband, her police officer husband, in court also. And she got free from him and was safe. As far as I know, even to today, I believe she's safe. Was he
charged with domestic violence, or was it just for the divorce proceeding? It
was just divorce. Okay. I just testified in the divorce. Everything it always got tossed out, swept away, like nothing happened, which is what I see quite a lot, unfortunately. But that was the first really hands-on moment that I had to sit with another victim and help them see that there's a new way. And that was just a tiny little portion of what I learned. But I could talk about this forever, obviously.
What do you feel like are some of the most, like, the first things you do now if somebody comes in and says, I'm in a domestic violence situation? And then, now they probably don't use these words, right? But as a clinical psychologist, we would say, do you feel safe at home?
Right.
And that safety piece,
yes.
If we don't feel safe, then we need to do something about that.
Yes.
So what are some things that you do now, knowing what you now know?
Well, one of the things, the very first thing I tell everybody is, and all the time that I've helped victims, and I've been able to help a lot of victims, thankfully. One of the first things that I always tell people is you don't have to be an expert in this field. You just have to be willing to be present with them and believe them. The very first thing you have to do is believe. Belief is so incredibly powerful and cathartic for a victim. And, they've likely been in a system where they haven't been listened to or believed for a long time, because abusers don't just groom the person, they groom they groom the community. And so that's why they often have such good reputations. They're police officers, they're CEOs, they're pastors, they're teachers, they're all these people that we sort of look to as man, these are the good people in society. And these are the people that we talk to our kids about. Hey, these are the people you listen to. So we're sort of set up to not believe victims when they say, well, this doctor did this, or this pastor said that, or whoever it is that's in these positions of authority. So I always say, start with belief. And people will often say to me, I'll get pushback real quick, particularly in Christian communities, sadly, but I'll get pushback and they'll say something like, yeah, but people lie all the time. And I'm just like, well, what do you mean by that? And that's the first thing I'll say to them. But so tell me what you mean by that. Well, I know this person who lied. Well, we all do, right? Like, people lie. But the reality is, statistically speaking, when someone says they're a victim of domestic violence, it's like 2 to 8%. And I think it's more like 2% from my experience that they might be lying, which means, when you look at it, it's like, so 92 to 98% of the people telling you that they're abused actually are. And in my experience, a victim is more likely to lie and say that she wasn't abused when she was abused. Why is that? Fear of reprisal of her abuser. So they want to sweep things under the rug and not ruffle feathers. They think it's going to cause more trouble for them, which it likely will.
Well, and if you think about even how Stacy started, they give us just the tip of the iceberg. And then they often gloss it over or make excuses for it.
Yeah.
So, oh, well, I actually was the one that made him mad. I mean, there's
Right.
so much gaslighting that happens.
Yes.
That the victim doesn't know up from down. And so
Right.
for them to even give us something, usually there's so much more underneath that surface.
Yeah, it's literally the tip of the iceberg. It's sort of like the presenting issue is not often the real issue, right? And I see that very, very often as I sit with victims.
Yeah.
So definitely start with belief. And what's so powerful, so much flows from that. When someone's believed and they really then at some point start to actually believe that you believe them, it's one thing to say that you believe someone. And I think so many victims sort of feel like, well, we'll see if you still do tomorrow. We'll see if you still do next week, or in 2 weeks or 2 months or a year. And when you consistently show that you're there and that you do believe them and that you're for them, they start to feel like this is someone that I can entrust another piece of my story with. And all sorts of beautiful things can happen when that occurs. And one thing that I always say too is help them get connected in a safe community. So offer safety. And when I say safe community, I don't mean a church. That's not what I mean. Now, if there is a church that's safe, awesome. If there are people within a church that are safe, awesome. Church leadership does not necessarily equate with safety. So help them connect with people that you do know are safe. There's a great ministry in this area called Focus Ministries, and it's a ministry for domestic violence survivors. And the woman who started it is a Christian who was abused for many years, and she couldn't find resources. So when she finally got free of her husband of 39 years, she decided that she had to create her own resources for women, because she wanted to be the hope for women that she didn't have when she needed it. So she did that, and she created this incredible network of ministries to help victims all over the Chicagoland suburbs. And oftentimes, she gets women connected in another town so that they have a measure of being removed from that area, so they're more likely to then feel comfortable and safe to open up.
Yeah, there's a couple of things I want to add to that. Rachel always says, like, you can't heal if you don't feel safe.
Yes.
So you can't just like move on or
Right.
get better if you're in an environment that's consistently unstable and
Yes.
full of drama. And then it reminds me when you say, if there's an environment where a survivor feels believed, what's fascinating about that is then they start to believe themselves, because for so long they've thought this isn't right. But the other person's like, whatever, it's fine. You're like, is it? And you're so confused.
Right.
But for somebody to say, you know what, you'll like the internal feelings you've had is correct. Like you should not be treated this way.
Right.
This is not healthy or normal or safe. That I feel like unlocks so much for survivors too, because then they can start to believe themselves again.
Oh yes, that's so good, because I really feel like it's not until someone really trusts that they know what's going on, and they know what's best for them. And that's one of the things that I would say to anyone in a helping profession is never dictate what someone should do. Tell them that you trust. Here are some options, but I trust that you know your story the best. You know it better than I do. So I'm never going to say, hey, you need to do this, or you should leave. Well, no, what? Leaving can be the very most dangerous time for victims of abuse. It's the moment that they say they're leaving, and the next 2 years that their level, the lethality checklist is like off the charts. They're in the most danger during that time. And also, when it comes to abuse, just something that I've learned over time is that if strangulation's involved, I think you're somewhere like 7 times more likely to be killed by your intimate partner if they've ever touched your neck. It's not choking. Choking's for food. Strangulation is an intentional, it's a way to control the very breath of a person. And if someone does that to you, you're way more likely to end up murdered at their hands.
So tell us, what is documenttheabuse.com?
Documenttheabuse.com is the website that houses the evidentiary affidavit of abuse that Susan Murphy Milano created, and then we used first in my church with that other police officer's wife. And I've used it many times over the years. There's someone now who serves as the executive director for the organization called Document the Abuse, and her name is Norma Peterson. And that name should sound familiar. She's actually Drew Peterson's sister-in-law. Wow. She was close friends with Stacy Peterson. So Norma runs that now. So I don't have as much involvement with that since she's running it, but it's a tremendous resource.
And so like what it does is it documents the abuse firsthand. And then if that person goes missing or passes away, that is used as evidence to put the perpetrator in jail.
That's exactly right. And so if a victim today goes to documenttheabuse.com, they'll be walked through a very simple process that's online, tells them everything to do. And that everything from that will be stored in a Fortune 500 level server. So it's very safe. They can trust this. And I think just a couple of people now have access to that, Norma being one of them. But nothing can be altered. The timestamps are all solid. It'll be notarized, so that it basically, it's the best chance of being someone's voice if they're incapacitated or murdered.
Wow. So I was just writing a list of you talking. I think if somebody here is listening and they have ever felt unsafe, I think one of the first things I would say is go get some help, go talk to somebody, don't just listen to a podcast and whatever, but like go get some help close by. But one of the things that we were taught to do is to create a safety plan, because you're right. You can't often just go, all right, I'm out of here and leave, because there's so much emotional and physical control within the home. And so what are some ideas for a safety plan that you've used in the past?
Well, Susan actually wrote a book on this, and I'm blank trying to think of the name of it, but I can get that to you so that you can include that as a link for anybody who watches. But she wrote a book that actually it's all about a safety plan, and it gives you just simple checklists to run through so that you have the best chance of getting away and staying away safely from your abuser. But there's so many things to do, like just a few general ideas. Gather important documents over time. It's amazing how many documents you need. It's like, if you've ever signed kids up for school, you realize they need like everything from you. So it's like all those things, pieces of mail that have your address on it, birth certificates, immunization records. Most of those things are online now. But getting a phone that's not attached to your abuser's account is super important. Most of the cell phone companies now, if you call them and you say you're a victim of abuse, they actually, I think by law now, have to separate that from the account of the abuser. And that's something that's been more recent, and that's a great thing. Also, I would say, if you have a car that you drive, take it to an auto shop that you trust and ask them to look for any devices that are put underneath it to track it. GPS is so easy now to track, but sometimes there really is a physical tracker on the car. So make sure you do those basics so you can start with physical safety. So physical safety is obviously the most important thing. But then gathering all those documents, connecting with a local shelter that offers free counseling, and it's very specific. Just any counselor is not the right person to go to. You need someone who's trained in these dynamics, and shelters all over here and all over the country are really, really good at helping victims break free so that they don't end up with another abuser who just happens to look different, that is going to do the same things to them.
Right.
What's interesting about going to a shelter as an option is usually, right, the first place the abuser will look will be all the close friends and family. And so certainly friends and family is an option as well. But if you think of who would the abuser go to first, maybe don't go there.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And also one thing that I would add, Susan taught me this very early on about domestic violence. She said, be careful what shelters you refer people to. She said, because if they receive government money at all, she said, a lot of these, if it's a police officer, they will use their connections in government to sort of like threaten their funding. She saw that happen. So it's just unbelievable. It's unbelievable deviance that these people use. And to me, it's just so evident that they're empowered by evil.
Yep.
Yeah. We've learned you can't make sense of evil. They're just living in a completely different world. It just doesn't make sense.
Well said.
But healing is possible. Safety is possible. And the first step is to admit what's really happening. I think before even a survivor comes forward, they're going through it in their own mind.
Right.
Is this okay? Is this my fault? Is this normal? And they're and so by the time they actually get to somebody and say, this is what's happening, they've been wrestling with it for a long time.
Right.
And so understanding or kind of coming to terms, we call it getting your head out of the sand, because oftentimes we live like, I'm fine, everything's fine, but our house is on fire. So really taking inventory and if you don't know, that's another reason to go and talk to somebody and start sharing what's happening in your home and get to the root of what's happening so you can be safe, because safety is a foundational need.
Yes.
And oftentimes the reason people will finally leave is when they feel and see their children are unsafe.
Right.
But I hope that it doesn't have to get to that point.
Right.
Or you are a survivor, a woman, or whoever it is, to feel safe themselves.
Right. And also, a lot of victims will believe things that were told to them. They'll say, well, I really have to stay because divorce is the worst thing. It's like, it says in the Bible, I think, that God hates divorce. And they take this one little passage that doesn't mean what they think it means because their pastors haven't studied the whole context of Scripture and what it talks about related to divorce. And then they stay in a marriage they never should have stayed in because it's not a marriage. Because the abuser is the one who breaks the covenant, not the one who decides to leave. Amen. The one who leaves is the one who says, I'm not going to put up with your breaking of the covenant. And oftentimes they break they break generational cycles of trauma when they finally decide, I'm going to end this here, because I don't want my son to grow up to be like his dad, and I don't want my daughter to grow up and marry her dad. So breaking free is incredibly important. Make sure that your churches have a theology that supports people to leave their abusers. And abuse is certainly not just physical. It's emotional, psychological, it's spiritual. If you have someone that's kind of like browbeating you with the Bible and saying, well, this is what a good wife does, and submit, run from any man who tells you to submit. Run fast and run far.
Amen. Amen. You're right. Oftentimes our survivors will say that when they went to go get help, their church said, well, just forgive, because that's the thing to do. And it just ruffles my feathers, because for safety is a foundational need. It's like food. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do.
Say, just eat garbage. It's fine. Like, no, you need sustenance to live. You need safety to live.
Yeah.
And so you're right. I think knowing who you're speaking to, if you do go get help, choose, do some research and choose people that are going to point you in the right direction.
Can we all just can we just get on a big tour bus and go talk to all the churches? Can we do that? Because I feel like we can make some stuff happen.
Yes, seriously.
So. Well, I know we just touched the tip of the iceberg with your story and everything you've been able to learn and grow and experience and evolve since that time. But this is such an important conversation, because as a counselor, and now I'm a Dream Life coach, relationships are key in, they're one of the foundation. I need a new word. Yeah. No, they're important. They're an important piece of our life. I often say it's purpose in your work, whether it's a business or a career or a mission, your relationships, and then your health. If any of those are out of whack, and you're going to be off kilter. And so
100%.
Rachel, any other thought before we end today?
Oh, I could ask him so many questions, because I've heard some stories from Neil about how he's, and I won't, because I know we're running low on time, but how he handles situations within the church whenever there's suspected abuse, or, he's just got some knowledge that a lot of pastors could glean from, and it would make for much safer churches just in general. They do not tolerate any sort of abuse, and I just applaud you for that.
Thank you so much.
Well, we now need to know what that is. What is the hard line, or how do you handle it when people come in?
Well, the story I'm thinking of, Neil, was the one where, I don't have all the details. You would, but basically the husband called you not long after the wife had admitted some of the things to you. Do you know which story I'm talking about that you shared with me? And then you were like, nope, you're not welcome. You're not right.
Yes. That was actually in our last church. And so this woman had showed up to our church one day, and she was standing in the back and just sort of tried to keep a distance, but sort of seemed engaged. So she shared her story with me and my wife, I think the next week. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, how'd you find us? And she said, well, I saw some of the things you were writing online, and I thought I would give a church like that a try. And I was like, oh my gosh, what an honor. So her story was horrendous. She was abused. She was in a quote unquote Christian marriage, and her husband held her down by her throat one day, and she escaped him and decided she was never going back. So she got herself free from him and her kids free, but her family didn't support her, and neither did her church, because her church kind of shouted forgive, reconcile. He repented, so you have to forgive and reconcile. Come on, do you even Christian right? That's kind of the attitude that they had towards her. And she said, I didn't care. She said, I didn't care what any of them said. They can say all they want. I'm not going. And I said, that's amazing. That's really incredible. It wasn't long after that the pastor that didn't support her but supported her husband reached out to me, and it was really at the start a really nice email. And he just said, oh, I know that there's a woman that now goes to your church. She used to go to mine, and her husband did admit that he one time pushed her and he's really embarrassed about it. But could you and I talk about this? And so I wrote the pastor back, and I said, hey, I'm so glad that you're ministering to this guy. And I said, but no, I'm not going to share anything with you. I'm not going to meet with you to talk about her. That's her business and not yours, frankly. And so he wrote back a real, high and mighty, spiritual, light, spiritually email to me, and basically said, oh, you're not a real pastor, you support divorce.
How about HIPAA laws, my friend? Goodness sakes.
Thank you. Yeah, they're not following any of that. A lot of them don't.
Yeah.
But then the guy reached out to me and he said, oh, thank you so much for taking care of my wife. What a good pastor you must be. I'd love to talk to you so you could hear my side. And I wrote back and I'm like, no, thanks. Good luck in your other church. I mean, it was really brief. And so they didn't like that. And I don't care.
Well, I think the question is who are we serving? Are we serving the survivors? Are we serving, widows and children and the people that need it?
The oppressed.
The oppressed, or are we catering to the narcissists who are just being manipulative and most likely are causing damage with most relationships they're in?
Right. Absolutely. And we have to stop. Like, one of the things too, I think, in our justice system and just understanding in churches and any community organizations, this is not an anger issue. This is a control issue.
Yeah.
This has nothing to do with anger. And how do you know that? Because they don't go crazy. Someone will say, oh, they just lost control. No, it was a very controlled thing that they did. And how do we know that? Because in most of their lives, they don't act like that at work or in public, or even when they're driving cars, when everybody has a little road rage. They're not doing those things. They're actually quite controlled. So the root of abuse is always control. It's not anger. It's this belief that they have the right to own a person, and they don't. Yeah.
It's not an accident. It's not a whoopsies. You know what I mean? This is intentional.
It is.
And I think that's what survivors need to hear too.
Yes.
Is when it comes to domestic violence, the cycle is there's the abuse, and then there's the honeymoon phase, because they come back and buy you gifts and say, I'm so sorry, I'll never do it again. And then there's fine for a little bit, and then there's abuse again. And so when you notice you're in that cycle, that's another warning sign that it's time to get out or do something different, because it's not a safe place to be.
And the latest thoughts on that related to domestic violence is that we used to say the honeymoon period, because it's sort of feels good. It's a lot of gift giving. It's a lot of sorries. It's a lot of, you're the most important person in my life. But a lot of the more recent thinking on this is that really it's not really a cycle. Even the part that appears to be kind and sweet, it's just a strategy of abuse.
It's manipulation. Mm-hmm.
Yes, it is. Just another way to control.
Absolutely. Yep. Well, we definitely will need to have you back on to keep the conversation
going.
I'd
love to.
Because I do think that
both.
This is certainly, and another thing you mentioned that we won't get into now, but is that often, if the healing process doesn't happen, a survivor can go from abuser to abuser to abuser. And there's a lot of things we talk about that quite a bit, is how and why that happens. So yes, we'll keep the conversation going in a part 2 if you're willing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rachel, is there anything you want to share or add?
I'm just so grateful you're here and all that you shared, and it's good stuff. Good stuff.
So good talking with you both.
Well, thank you, Neil, for your time and wisdom today. You guys check out documenttheabuse.com, and then we'll also put Susan's book in about the safety plan in the show notes too.
For sure.
And if you are somebody who does not feel safe at home, our recommendation is to go find a counselor, a pastor, support in some way, because safety is foundational and you deserve to feel safe in your own home.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much for hanging out with us. Comment any thoughts or questions for Neil below, like and subscribe. We appreciate hanging out with you each and every week. And with that, we'll see you next time. Thank you so much for listening to this powerful episode of Stop Suffering in Silence. If you are interested in booking Rachel to speak at your school, your church, or on your podcast, then please email openblindeyes@protonmail.com. If you are interested in sponsoring a survivor on their healing journey and would like to donate to Stop SIS, then please check out the link in the description box or show notes below, or you can email stopsis@protonmail.com. And finally, if you are currently suffering in silence, or you know somebody who is, whether they're dealing with a current trauma or one from the past, then we will always recommend that you reach out to your local resources and find a counselor that you can trust, because nobody is meant to suffer alone. Have an amazing week, and thank you for being here.